Picture an endless void where darkness ruled for eternity until a voice of infinite power whispered, "Let there be light." But what happens when that light fades, swallowed by the very creation it brought forth? Have you ever felt an ancient ache in your soul? A longing to return to a paradise lost, where the first sin still whispers through the ages? Amidst the torrents of a great flood, Noah clung to a divine promise, a covenant written in the colors of a rainbow. But can humanity ever truly keep such a sacred vow? Abraham stood beneath a sky ablaze with stars, hearing God's promise of a nation. Yet would you dare to believe that faith can endure the anguish of a father's sacrifice? And through the dreams of Joseph, a betrayed son sold into slavery, God wove a tapestry of redemption. Step into this sacred journey where light and shadow dance in the depths of your spirit. The book of Genesis is not just a chronicle of beginnings. It is a mirror of your soul's eternal quest. Let us embark on this mystical odyssey where the divine and the human intertwine. Before the concept of time was born, before the stars found their place in the heavens, there existed only an infinite void, a formless abyss where chaos reigned supreme. Yet within this nothingness, the Almighty's will stirred a presence, both unseen and all-encompassing. A voice resonant with the power of creation broke the silence. "Let there be light," and in that moment, light erupted like a celestial flame, piercing the darkness with a radiance that echoed across the cosmos. The heavens awoke adorned with stars that shimmered like divine tears, each one a testament to the Creator's boundless love. Below the earth took shape, sculpted by the hands of eternity. Rivers carved their winding paths through emerald valleys. Mountains rose in majestic splendor, their peaks kissed by the first rays of dawn, and the seas roared with a primal song of life. Every blade of grass, every fluttering bird, every creature that roamed the land or swam the depths of the ocean was a stroke in the Creator's masterpiece. God surveyed his work, and with a voice that resonated with divine satisfaction, he declared, "It is good." But the Creator's vision was not yet fulfilled. In the heart of Eden, a garden of unparalleled beauty, God knelt to the earth, his hands gathering the dust, with a tenderness that belied his infinite power. From this humble clay, he molded a being unlike any other, a reflection of his own image, a vessel for his divine breath. He named him Adam, the first of mankind, and with a gentle exhale, God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Adam's chest rose, his eyes fluttered open, and for the first time he beheld the world, a world where every sunrise was a hymn of praise, where every breeze carried the whisper of eternity. God spoke to him, his voice both a command and a blessing. "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and have dominion over all that I have made. The fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, and every living creature shall be under your care." Eden was a sanctuary, a paradise where death held no dominion, where sorrow and pain were unknown. Here God walked with Adam their communion, a sacred dance of Creator and creation, each step a testament to their unbroken bond. Yet in this perfect harmony, Adam stood alone, a solitary figure in a world of pairs. Every creature had its companion, but Adam longed for one like himself, a partner to share in the wonders of Eden. Sensing this longing, God declared, "It is not good for man to be alone." He caused a deep slumber to fall upon Adam, and as the first man slept, God took a rib from his side, a piece of his very being. From this rib, he crafted a companion, a woman of radiant beauty, whom Adam would name Eve. When Adam awoke, his eyes met hers and his heart leapt with recognition. "This is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh." He proclaimed, his voice trembling with awe and wonder. "She shall be called woman, for she was taken from man." Together they stood in the light of Eden, their hearts unmarred by shame or fear, their days filled with the joy of divine presence. They walked hand in hand, their laughter mingling with the songs of the garden, their love a reflection of the Creator's own. But in the shadows of Eden, an ancient enemy stirred its eyes gleaming with malice. The serpent, the deceiver, watched with cold calculation, waiting for the moment to strike. In the center of the garden stood two trees, each a symbol of divine purpose. The tree of life, its branches heavy with the promise of eternity, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. its fruit shimmering with a forbidden allure that seemed to pulse with hidden power. God had given Adam a solemn warning. You may eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for the day you do, you will surely die. Yet the serpent, driven by a hatred for all that was good, slithered into Eden, its scales glinting like shards of darkness in the sunlight. It approached Eve, its voice a venomous whisper that seemed to weave itself into her thoughts. Did God truly say you cannot eat from any tree in the garden? Eve hesitated, her gaze flickering to the tree in question. We may eat of the trees, she replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. But of the one in the midst of the garden, God said, you shall not eat or touch it, lest you die. The serpent's eyes narrowed its tone, dripping with deceit. You will not die. God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like him, knowing good and evil. The words sank into Eve's heart like a poisoned arrow, stirring a desire she had never known. She turned to the tree, its fruit now glowing with an irresistible beauty, its scarlet skin glistening like a forbidden jewel. It seemed good for food, a delight to the eyes, and in her heart a whisper grew, a longing to be like God, to possess the knowledge he held. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she plucked the fruit, the weight of her choice heavy in her hand. She took a bite, the taste both sweet and bitter, a sensation that coursed through her like a storm. Then she turned to Adam, who stood nearby, watching in silence. Without a word, she offered him the fruit, and he too ate, his trust in her, outweighing his trust in God's command. In that moment, the world shifted, as if the very fabric of creation had been torn asunder. Their eyes were opened not to divine wisdom, but to a new and terrible reality. They saw their nakedness, their vulnerability, and for the first time, shame flooded their hearts. They scrambled to cover themselves, weaving fig leaves into crude garments, their hands trembling with fear. They hid among the trees, their once joyful hearts, now strangers to the peace they had known. The air grew heavy with the weight of their disobedience, and then they heard it, the voice of God calling through the garden like a gentle breeze. Adam, where are you? Adam's voice quivered as he replied, I heard your voice, and I was afraid, for I was naked, and I hid. God's question cut through the silence, both tender and piercing. Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree? I commanded you not to. Adam's gaze shifted to Eve, his words laced with blame. The woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit, and I ate. Eve, in turn, pointed to the serpent. The serpent deceived me, and I ate. The weight of their choices hung in the air, a dark fracture in the divine tapestry of creation. God turned to the serpent, his voice a decree of judgment. Because you have done this, you are cursed above all creatures. You will crawl on your belly, and from the seed of the woman, one will come to crush your head. To Eve, he said, your pain in childbirth will be great, and you will desire your husband, yet he will rule over you. To Adam he declared, cursed is the ground because of you. Through toil and sweat you will eat of it all your days, and you will return to the dust from which you came. Eden's gates closed forever, guarded by a flaming sword that turned every way a barrier between man and paradise. Yet even in judgment, God's mercy shone through. Before casting them out, he clothed them in garments of animal skins, a tender act that hinted at the cost of their sin, the first shedding of blood, a foreshadowing of the ultimate sacrifice to come. And in his words to the serpent, a promise was sown. From the seed of the woman, one will come to crush your head. Though sin had entered the world, death would not have the final word. Adam and Eve stepped into a world now marred by thorns and toil, their hearts heavy with the loss of Eden. But within them burned a flicker of hope, a hope that one day, the light they had lost would be restored. Outside the gates of Eden, Adam and Eve began their new life, their hands now calloused by the earth's resistance, their hearts shadowed by the memory of paradise. But life continued, and Eve bore a son, her voice filled with hope. I have acquired a man with the Lord's help. They named him Cain, the firstborn of humanity, a symbol of new beginnings. Soon after, a second son was born, Abel, a gentle soul whose eyes seemed to reflect the light of a world he had never known. Cain grew to be a tiller of the soil, his days spent wrestling with the stubborn earth, while Abel became a shepherd, tending his flocks with a quiet reverence, his heart attuned to the rhythms of creation. Both brothers knew of God, having heard the stories of Eden from their parents, the garden, the trees, the serpent, and the promise. But their hearts walked different paths. The time came to offer sacrifices, a sacred act to honor the Creator who had not abandoned them. Cain brought an offering from the ground fruits of his labor, a modest gift that reflected his divided heart. Abel, however, selected the best of his flock, the fattest, purest lambs, their wool glistening in the sunlight, a gift of devotion that poured from a heart fully surrendered to God. God looked upon their offerings, his gaze piercing the outward act to the inward truth. He accepted Abel's sacrifice, seeing the purity of his devotion, but Cain's offering was rejected, for it lacked the reverence and surrender that God desired. Cain's face darkened, his eyes narrowing with jealousy, his heart a storm of resentment and wounded pride. God in his mercy spoke to Cain, his voice both a warning and an invitation. Why are you angry, Cain? Why has your countenance fallen? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not sin, crouches at your door like a beast, its desire to consume you, but you must master it. The words echoed in Cain's mind, a divine plea to turn from the darkness within. But Cain turned away, his heart hardening with each passing moment. He brooded in silence, his thoughts consumed by the sight of Abel's favored offering, the sound of Abel's laughter, the warmth of Abel's faith. The beast of sin growled louder, its claws tightening around Cain's soul. One day, Cain called to his brother, his voice deceptively calm. "Abel, come with me to the fields." Abel, trusting and unsuspecting, followed, his shepherd's staff in hand. His flock grazing peacefully nearby, the sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the earth as the brothers walked in silence. Then, in a moment of unrestrained rage, Cain turned on Abel. He struck him with a force born of hatred, his hands trembling as he watched his brother fall. Blood poured from Abel's wounds, soaking the earth in a crimson stain. The first human blood spilled, a mark that would forever scar the world. Abel's eyes, once bright with life, grew dim, his breath fading as he lay motionless on the ground. God's voice broke through the stillness, a thunderous call laced with sorrow. "Cain, where is your brother Abel?" Cain's reply was cold, his voice dripping with defiance. "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" But God answered, his words heavy with divine justice. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer, and the ground will no longer yield to you." Cain's heart quaked, his defiance crumbling into fear. "My punishment is too great to bear. Anyone who finds me will kill me." In mercy, God placed a mark on Cain, a sign of protection that ensured no one would take his life, but also a reminder of his sin, a mark that would follow him all his days. Cain wandered to the land of Nod, east of Eden, far from the presence of God. There he built a city, a monument to his exile, and his descendants multiplied each generation, carrying the seed of his rebellion. But with every passing year, wickedness grew like a weed, choking the earth with selfishness, violence, and corruption. The light of Eden grew dimmer, the promise of redemption, a faint whisper in a world consumed by darkness. Yet even in this growing shadow, God's plan remained a thread of hope woven through the tapestry of human failure, waiting for the day when the seed of the woman would rise to crush the serpent's head. The earth became a cauldron of sin, every thought of man steeped in evil, every deed a rebellion against the Creator who had breathed life into them. Violence filled the land, brother turned against brother, father against son, and the cries of the oppressed rose. Like a bitter lament, God looked upon humanity, his heart heavy with sorrow, and declared, "My spirit will not strive with man forever. Their days shall be 120 years. I will wipe them from the face of the earth, for their wickedness is great, and every intent of their hearts is only evil." Continually, the world had turned its back on its Creator, and the time for judgment had come. But in the midst of this darkness, one man found grace in the eyes of the Lord, Noah, a righteous soul whose heart remained faithful amidst a sea of corruption. Noah walked with God his life, a quiet testament to the faith that had sustained him through a world gone astray. God spoke to him, his voice both a command and a promise. "Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, but I will establish my covenant with you. Build an ark of gopher wood, make it with 3 levels, and seal its planks with pitch. Its length shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. For within this ark I will preserve those who shall live. Noah obeyed without question, his faith a beacon in the gathering storm. For over a century he labored under the scorching sun, his hands calloused from the rough wood, his heart steadfast, despite the mockery of those around him. The people scoffed, their voices dripping with scorn. Noah, you old fool, it has never rained. Why build an ark in the middle of dry land? You speak of a God we cannot see, a judgment that will never come. But Noah did not waver. He drove each nail with purpose, sealed each plank with care. His every action a declaration of trust in the God who had spoken. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, worked alongside him, their hands joining their fathers in a labor of faith. While Noah's wife prepared provisions, her heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. When the ark was complete, its massive form standing like a silent sentinel against the horizon, God gave the final command: take your family, your wife, your sons and their wives, and enter the ark of every animal. You shall bring a pair, male and female, to keep them alive with you. For in 7 days I will send rain upon the earth. The animals came, a procession of divine order that defied the chaos of the world. Lions and lambs, eagles and doves, creatures great and small, all drawn by the hand of God. 2 by 2 they entered the ark, their steps echoing with the rhythm of creation itself. Noah and his family followed, their hearts a mixture of awe and trepidation. And as the last of them stepped inside, God shut the doors, sealing their fate and the fate of the world outside. The sky grew dark, the air thick with an ominous stillness. Then a single drop fell, followed by another, until the heavens opened with a roar. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rain poured without ceasing, a deluge that seemed to weep for the world it was destroying. The fountains of the deep burst forth, the rivers overflowed their banks, and the seas rose like a ravenous beast swallowing the land in their fury. The mountains, once proud and unyielding, vanished beneath the waters, their peaks no match for the judgment of God. Outside the ark, men and women fled to higher ground, their voices rising in desperate cries as they pounded on the ark's doors. Noah opened the door, "Save us," but the door remained shut, for God had sealed it, and the time for mercy had passed. The earth was submerged, every living thing that breathed the air. Perished kings and peasants, the mighty and the weak, all swept away by the flood. Inside the ark, Noah and his family huddled together, the sound of the rain a constant reminder of the world they had left behind. The animals too were silent, their instincts subdued by the presence of the divine. For 150 days the waters prevailed, a vast ocean covering the earth, a grave for the sins of man. But slowly the waters began to recede, the rain ceased, and the ark came to rest on the peaks of Mount Ararat, its wooden hull cradled by the mountain's embrace. Noah waited, his faith unwavering, and sent out a raven which did not return its wings, lost to the still wet world. Then he sent a dove, her white feathers a symbol of hope. She returned with an olive leaf in her beak, a sign that the earth was being reborn, its wounds healing under the touch of God's mercy. A week later, Noah sent the dove again, and this time she did not return. The earth was ready for a new beginning. God spoke his voice, a balm to Noah's weary heart. "Come out of the ark, you, your family, and every living creature with you. Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth once more. I establish my covenant with you and with all creation. No more will I destroy the earth with a flood." Noah stepped onto the renewed earth, the ground soft beneath his feet, the air fresh with the scent of new life. He built an altar, the first act of worship in this new world, and offered sacrifices to God, the smoke rising like a prayer of gratitude. Then a miracle appeared in the sky, a bow of light, its colors shimmering among the clouds. A rainbow that stretched from horizon to horizon. God declared, "This is the sign of my covenant. Whenever the rainbow appears, remember my promise. I will never again destroy the earth with water." Noah fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face, his heart overwhelmed by the mercy of the God who had spared him. The sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, stepped into this new world, their families destined to repopulate the earth. But though the flood had cleansed the land, The seed of sin remained in the hearts of men, waiting for the opportunity to take root once more. The rainbow stood as a reminder of God's mercy, but also as a warning that while God's judgment could be stayed, his righteousness demanded obedience. Noah's story was a testament to the power of faith, a beacon of hope in a world reborn, but the journey of humanity was far from over. The descendants of Noah spread across the earth, their numbers growing as nations and peoples took root in the far corners of the land. But in their hearts, the old sin lingered, a whisper of rebellion that had survived the flood. In the plain of Shinar, a people united not by faith but by pride gathered with a singular purpose. They spoke with one language, their voices echoing with ambition. Come, let us build a city and a tower that reaches to the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered across the earth. Their words were a challenge to the Creator, a declaration of independence from the God who had spared them. Brick by brick, the tower rose, its foundation laid with the mortar of human arrogance, its height a testament to their defiance. They sought to ascend to the divine, to rival God himself, their hands working in unison as their voices chanted songs of self-glory. The tower became a monument to their pride, its peak piercing the clouds, a symbol of their refusal to bow to the one who had created them. They dreamed of a unity that excluded God, a kingdom built on their own strength, a legacy that would immortalize their name. But God looked upon their work, his heart grieved by their rebellion. He said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all speak the same language. Now nothing they propose to do will be impossible for them. Let us go down and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another." In an instant, the language of men was shattered, their words splintered into a cacophony of foreign tongues. The workers, once united, now shouted in languages they could not comprehend, their voices a chaotic symphony of confusion. A man called for a brick, but his companion heard only gibberish. Another shouted for mortar, but the response was a string of unintelligible sounds. Frustration turned to anger, anger to despair, and the work on the tower ground to a halt. The people scattered across the earth, their unity broken, their pride brought low. The city was left unfinished, its tower, a crumbling relic of human folly, and they called it Babel. For there, God confused their language, humbling their ambition. The scattering of Babel was a divine reminder that to rise against God is to fall into ruin, that true unity comes not from human strength, but from submission to the Creator. The people spread to the ends of the earth, their languages a barrier that would shape their destinies, but also a testament to God's sovereignty. Yet even in this act of judgment, God's plan for redemption remained a thread of hope that would weave through the nations, waiting for the day when a new language, the language of love and sacrifice, would unite humanity once more. Centuries passed and the world grew darker, its people steeped in idolatry and self-worship. But in the midst of this spiritual wilderness, God called a man named Abraham, a man neither a king nor a warrior, but a humble soul willing to listen. God's voice came to him, both a command and a promise. Leave your country, your kindred, and your father's house, and go to the land. I will show you, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Abraham, though aged and without a clear path, trusted the voice of the unseen God. He left Ur of the Chaldeans, his home, his past, his security, and journeyed into the unknown, his wife Sarah by his side, his heart anchored in faith. They traveled through deserts and valleys, their steps guided by a promise they could not yet see. One night as they camped beneath a sky ablaze with stars, God appeared to Abraham again. "Look to the heavens, Abraham." He said, his voice a melody of divine assurance. "Count the stars if you are able, so shall your descendants be." Abraham gazed at the countless lights above each one, a testament to the magnitude of God's promise, and he believed. But the years stretched on, and Sarah remained barren, her womb closed by the passage of time. Doubt crept into their hearts, a shadow that threatened to dim their faith. In her longing for a child, Sarah gave her servant Hagar to Abraham, hoping to build a family. Through her, Hagar bore Ishmael, a son born of human effort, but he was not the child of promise. God appeared once more, his presence a radiant light in the darkness of their waiting. I am God Almighty. He declared, Sarah will bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac. With him I will establish my covenant, an everlasting covenant, for his descendants after him. Abraham was 100 years old, Sarah 90. Their bodies too old, their hope too frail, yet with God nothing is impossible. Sarah conceived her laughter of disbelief turning to laughter of joy as she held Isaac in her arms, the child of promise, the miracle that defied time. Abraham named him Isaac, meaning laughter, for God had turned their sorrow into a song of rejoicing. But the greatest test of Abraham's faith was yet to come. Years later, when Isaac had grown into a young man, God spoke again, his voice heavy with purpose. Abraham, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There offer him as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. The words struck Abraham like a dagger, his heart breaking under the weight of the command. Isaac, the son he had waited for, the child of promise, the joy of his old age. How could God ask such a thing? Yet Abraham did not waver. His faith, forged through years of waiting, held firm. He rose early the next morning, his hands steady as he gathered the wood, the fire and the knife, his heart resolute as he took Isaac and 2 servants and set out for Moriah. The journey was silent, each step a prayer, each breath a surrender. On the 3rd day, Abraham saw the mountain in the distance, its peak shrouded in mist, a sacred place chosen by God. He turned to his servants, his voice calm but heavy. Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go worship, and we will return to you. Isaac carried the wood on his back, a foreshadowing of a greater sacrifice to come, while Abraham held the fire and the knife. As they climbed, Isaac's innocent voice broke the silence. Father, here is the wood and the fire, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice? Abraham's throat tightened, his eyes brimming with unshed tears, but his faith spoke through his pain. God will provide the lamb, my son. At the summit, Abraham built the altar, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with the weight of his obedience. He laid the wood in order, bound Isaac with cords, and placed him on the altar, his heart shattering with each movement. Isaac, trusting his father, as Abraham trusted God, did not resist, his eyes fixed on the heavens, his faith mirroring his father's. Abraham raised the knife, its blade glinting in the sunlight, his soul crying out to the God who had promised. In that moment, a voice thundered from heaven, urgent and merciful. Abraham, Abraham, do not lay your hand on the boy, nor do him any harm. Now I know that you fear God, for you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Abraham lowered the knife, his body trembling with relief, and turned to see a ram caught in a thicket by its horns, a substitute provided by God. He unbound. Isaac took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering, the smoke rising as a testament to his faith. God spoke again, his voice filled with divine affirmation. Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, I will surely bless you. I will multiply your descendants like the stars of the heavens and the sand on the seashore. Through your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. Abraham and Isaac descended the mountain. Their bond deepened, their faith proven. Mount Moriah became a sacred place, a prophetic sign of a greater sacrifice to come. For one day on that same mountain, a father would offer his son, and his blood would bring redemption to all mankind. Abraham's story was a testament to the power of faith, a beacon of hope that would guide his descendants through the trials to come. Isaac inherited the covenant of his father, a legacy of faith passed down through the generations. He married Rebekah, a woman of beauty and strength, chosen by God to be his partner in the divine plan. Rebekah bore him twin sons, Esau and Jacob. But even in the womb, they struggled, a sign of the destinies that awaited them. Rebekah, troubled by the turmoil within her, sought the Lord, and he answered, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples divided from your body. The older shall serve the younger, and one shall be stronger than the other. When the time came, Esau was born first, red and hairy, a rugged child destined to be a hunter, a man of the wild. Jacob followed, grasping Esau's heel, a sign of the struggle that would define their lives, and they named him Jacob, meaning he who grasps the heel, or supplanter. The brothers grew, their differences stark. Esau became a man of the fields, his skin weathered by the sun, his hands skilled with the bow, his heart untamed and impulsive. Jacob, in contrast, was a quiet man dwelling in tents, his mind sharp and calculating, his heart set on the blessing of his father. One day Esau returned from a hunt, his body weary, his stomach empty. Jacob was cooking a red stew, its aroma filling the air with a tantalizing promise. Esau, driven by hunger, pleaded, "Give me some of that red stew, I'm famished." Jacob saw his opportunity, his voice calm, but cunning. "First sell me your birthright." Esau, despising the spiritual inheritance that came with being the firstborn, replied, "What good is a birthright if I die of hunger? Take it." He swore an oath, trading his birthright for a bowl of stew, a choice that revealed the depth of his disregard for God's covenant. Jacob took the birthright, his heart set on the blessing that would secure his destiny. Years later, Isaac grew old, his eyes dimmed by age, his body frail. Sensing his time was near, he called for Esau, his favorite son, and said, "My son, I am old and do not know the day of my death. Take your bow hunt game for me and prepare a meal I love so that I may bless you before I die." Rebekah overheard, her heart stirred by the prophecy God had given her. The older would serve the younger. She called Jacob, her voice urgent. "Your father plans to bless Esau. Go to the flock, bring me 2 young goats, and I will prepare a meal for your father. You will take it to him and receive the blessing in Esau's place." Jacob hesitated. "But Mother, Esau is hairy and I am smooth. If my father touches me, he will know I deceived him, and I will bring a curse upon myself, not a blessing." Rebekah replied, "Let the curse fall on me, my son. Do as I say." Rebekah prepared the meal, dressing Jacob in Esau's clothes, their scent of the fields masking his identity. She covered his arms and neck with goat skins, mimicking Esau's hairiness, and sent him to Isaac. Jacob entered, his voice trembling as he lied. "Father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you asked. Rise, eat, and bless me." Isaac, suspicious, asked, "How did you find game so quickly?" Jacob replied, "The Lord your God brought it to me." Isaac reached out, touching Jacob's arms, feeling the goat skins and smelling the garments. Though his heart wavered, he believed the deception and gave the blessing. "May God give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth, plenty of grain and wine. May people serve you and nations bow to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow to you. Cursed be those who curse you, and blessed be those who bless you." Jacob left, his heart racing, but moments later Esau returned with his hunt. He prepared the meal and approached his father. "Rise, father, and bless your son Esau." Isaac trembled, realizing the deception. "Who was it that brought me food, whom I blessed? Your brother came with deceit and has taken your blessing." Esau wept bitterly. "He has deceived me twice. He took my birthright and now my blessing. Do you have no blessing for me?" Isaac replied, "I have made him lord over you, but you will live by the sword and serve your brother. When you grow restless, you will break his yoke." Esau's heart burned with hatred, and he vowed, "When my father dies, I will kill Jacob." Rebekah, hearing of Esau's plans, sent Jacob to her brother Laban in Haran, saying, "Flee, my son, until your brother's anger subsides." Jacob fled a fugitive, with the blessing he had stolen, his heart heavy with the cost of his deception. One night as he journeyed, he stopped to rest, using a stone for a pillow. As he slept, he dreamed a ladder stretched from earth to heaven, its rungs gleaming with celestial light, angels ascending and descending in a divine procession. At the top stood God, his voice a melody of promise. "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham and Isaac. The land where you lie I will give to you and your descendants. They will be like the dust of the earth, spreading to the north, south, east, and west. Through you all the families of the earth will be blessed. I am with you, and I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken." Jacob awoke, trembling, his heart awash with awe. "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. This is the house of God, the gate of heaven." He took the stone, set it up as a pillar, poured oil on it, and named the place Bethel, vowing, "If God is with me and brings me back safely, he will be my God, and I will give him a tenth of all I have." Jacob continued to Haran, where he met Rachel, Laban's younger daughter, her beauty captivating his heart. He approached Laban, offering to work 7 years for Rachel's hand in marriage. Laban agreed, but on the wedding night, he deceived Jacob, giving him Leah, Rachel's older sister, instead. When Jacob awoke and discovered the deception, he confronted Laban. "Why have you done this I serve for Rachel?" Laban replied, "It is not our custom to give the younger before the older. Serve another 7 years, and you may have Rachel too." Jacob, his love for Rachel unwavering, agreed, serving another 7 years, his heart enduring the pain of betrayal as he had once betrayed. God blessed Jacob with children. Leah bore him Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, while Rachel, after years of barrenness, bore Joseph, a child who would become the joy of Jacob's heart. But tensions with Laban grew, and God spoke to Jacob. "Return to the land of your fathers, I will be with you." Jacob prepared to leave, but he knew returning meant facing Esau, the brother he had wronged. On the journey, he sent gifts ahead to appease Esau, his heart gripped by fear. That night, as his family crossed the river Jabbok, Jacob remained alone, wrestling with his past, his fears, and his God. A mysterious figure appeared, and they wrestled until dawn, neither yielding. The stranger touched Jacob's hip, dislocating it, and said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." Jacob clung to him. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The stranger asked, "What is your name, Jacob?" He replied, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and man and have prevailed." Jacob released his grip, his body wounded, but his heart transformed. He named the place Peniel, saying, "I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been spared." The next day, Jacob saw Esau approaching with 400 men. Fearing the worst, he bowed 7 times, but Esau ran to him, embracing him with tears in his eyes. "My brother Esau," said, his voice breaking, "I have missed you." Jacob wept. The past healed, the blessing restored. Jacob now, Israel, settled in the land, his 12 sons, the patriarchs of a nation that would bear God's promise, a nation through which the Savior of the world would one day come. Israel's 12 sons were the foundation of a great nation. But Joseph, born to Rachel in Israel's old age, held a special place in his father's heart. Israel crafted for Joseph a coat of many colors, its vibrant hues, a symbol of favor that set him apart from his brothers. But this favor sparked jealousy, a bitter seed that grew in the hearts of his siblings. Joseph, innocent and full of faith, began to have dreams, visions that spoke of his destiny. He shared them with his brothers, his voice bright with excitement. "We were binding sheaves in the field, and my sheaf rose while yours gathered around and bowed to mine." The brothers scoffed, "Will you reign over us?" But Joseph dreamed again. "I saw the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing to me." Even Israel rebuked him. "Will your mother, brothers, and I bow to you?" The dreams fueled his brothers' hatred, their jealousy, a fire that consumed them. One day, Israel sent Joseph to check on his brothers as they tended the flocks in Dothan. They saw him approaching, his coat a blaze of color against the horizon, and their hatred boiled over. "Here comes the dreamer," they sneered. "Let's kill him and throw him into a pit, and we'll say a wild beast devoured him." Reuben, the eldest, intervened. "Let us not shed blood. Throw him into this pit, but do not harm him, hoping to rescue him later." The brothers agreed, stripping Joseph of his coat and casting him into a dry cistern, its walls cold and unyielding. Joseph cried out, his voice echoing in the darkness, but his brothers turned away, sitting down to eat while their brother languished below. A caravan of Ishmaelite traders passed by their camels laden with goods bound for Egypt. Judah, seeing an opportunity, said, "What profit is it if we kill him? Let us sell him to these traders. He is our brother after all, for 20 pieces of silver." Joseph was sold, his hands bound, his heart breaking, as he was led away from the land of his father. The brothers dipped his coat in goat's blood, presenting it to Israel with a lie. "We found this. Does it belong to your son?" Israel recognized the coat, his cries of anguish piercing the night. "A beast has devoured him. Joseph is no more." He tore his garments, mourning for days, inconsolable in his grief. Joseph was taken to Egypt, a foreign land where he knew no one. His freedom stolen, his dreams seemingly shattered. He was sold to Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's guard, a man of power and influence. But God was with Joseph. His presence, a quiet strength in the midst of suffering. Joseph served with integrity, and Potiphar saw that everything Joseph touched prospered. He made Joseph overseer of his house, entrusting him with all he owned, saying, "All that I have is under your command, for the Lord blesses my house because of you, Joseph." Though a slave rose to a position of honor, his heart steadfast in his faith, his hands diligent in his work. But honor came with peril. Potiphar's wife, captivated by Joseph's youth, and beauty sought to seduce him, her voice a siren's call. Lie with me, Joseph, day. After day she pursued him, her desire a relentless storm. But Joseph resisted, his voice firm with conviction. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, his wife. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? One day when they were alone in the house, she grabbed his garment, her eyes blazing with lust. Joseph fled, leaving his garment in her hands, choosing to lose his cloak rather than his integrity. Enraged by his rejection, she accused him falsely, showing the garment to Potiphar. This Hebrew tried to violate me. Potiphar, though he knew Joseph's character, could not ignore the accusation and cast him into prison, the bars closing around him like a tomb. Even in prison, God did not abandon Joseph. The wardens saw his integrity and placed him in charge of the prisoners, saying, "Everything you do prospers even here." In the darkness of his cell, Joseph found purpose, his faith a light that could not be extinguished. Two of Pharaoh's officials, the cupbearer and the baker, were imprisoned with him, each troubled by a dream. Joseph, gifted by God to interpret dreams, listened as the cupbearer shared. I saw a vine with 3 branches and I squeezed grapes into Pharaoh's cup. Joseph replied, the 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days you will be restored to your position. When you are, please remember me. The baker, encouraged, shared his dream. I had 3 baskets on my head and birds ate from the top basket. Joseph's voice grew somber. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, you will be hanged. Both interpretations came true. The cupbearer was restored, the baker executed, but the cupbearer forgot Joseph, leaving him in prison for 2 more years. Then Pharaoh dreamed visions that troubled his spirit: 7 fat cows devoured by 7 thin cows, 7 full heads of grain consumed by 7 withered ones. None of his magicians could interpret the dreams, but the cupbearer remembered Joseph saying, "There is a Hebrew in prison who interprets dreams with accuracy." Joseph was brought before Pharaoh. His body cleaned his clothes, changed his heart, steady with faith. Pharaoh shared his dreams, and Joseph replied, "God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 fat cows and full heads of grain are 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine, represented by the thin cows and withered heads. Appoint a wise man to store grain during the good years that Egypt may survive the famine." Pharaoh, struck by Joseph's wisdom, declared, "Can we find another like this man, in whom is the Spirit of God? You shall be governor of Egypt, second only to me." Joseph, once a slave, now stood as Egypt's second in command, a ring of authority on his finger, a chariot at his command. His name proclaimed Zaphanath-Paneah, revealer of secrets. He stored grain during the years of abundance, building storehouses that overflowed with provision. When the famine struck, Egypt had bread, but the world hungered. In Canaan, Israel and his sons suffered, their stores depleted. Israel sent his sons to Egypt, all except Benjamin, Joseph's full brother, whom he kept close, fearing to lose another son. The 10 brothers arrived bowing before the governor, not knowing he was Joseph, the brother they had sold. Joseph recognized them, his heart torn between pain and longing, but he hid his identity, speaking harshly. "You are spies, come to see the weakness of our land," they protested. "No, my lord, we are 12, brothers, sons of one man in Canaan. The youngest is with our father, and one is no more." Joseph tested them, seeking to know if their hearts had changed. He demanded, "Bring your youngest brother, or you will not see my face again." He imprisoned Simeon, sending the others back with grain, but secretly returned their money, a test of their honesty. They returned to Israel trembling. The man of Egypt spoke harshly and took Simeon. "We must bring Benjamin, or we cannot return." Israel wept, "Joseph is gone. Simeon is gone. Will I lose Benjamin too?" But the famine worsened, and he relented, sending Benjamin with them, his heart heavy with fear. When they returned, Joseph saw Benjamin, his brother, and his heart ached with love. He prepared a feast, seating them by age, giving Benjamin 5 times the portion, watching for signs of jealousy. As they prepared to leave, Joseph ordered his silver cup placed in Benjamin's sack, a final test. His guards stopped them on the road, searching their sacks, and found the cup. The brothers were brought back trembling, and Judah pleaded, "My lord, if Benjamin does not return, our father will die of sorrow. Take me as a slave in his place, but let the boy go." Joseph could bear it no longer. Tears streamed down his face as he revealed himself. "I am Joseph, your brother whom you sold into slavery. Do not be distressed. It was not you who sent me here, but God to preserve life." The brothers wept their guilt and fear, melting into awe at God's providence. Joseph embraced them, forgiveness, healing the wounds of the past. Joseph sent for Israel, providing wagons and provisions for the journey. When Israel heard Joseph is alive, his spirit revived, and he traveled to Egypt. Father and son reunited their tears, a river of joy after years of separation. Israel said, "Now I can die in peace, for I have seen your face." Joseph settled his family in Goshen, where they prospered, their numbers growing into a nation. Israel lived out his days, blessing his sons before his death. Joseph too grew old, and as he died, he made his brothers swear, "God will visit you and bring you to the land." He promised Abraham, Isaac, and me, "When he does carry my bones with you." Joseph's life, marked by betrayal and redemption, was a testament to God's faithfulness, a bridge to the next chapter of God's plan. Conclusion. The book of Genesis is a sacred tapestry woven with threads of light and shadow, sin and redemption, despair and hope. From the first breath of Adam to the final words of Joseph, it reveals a God who never abandons his creation, a God whose promises endure through every trial, every betrayal, every tear. Can you hear his voice calling you back to the light that birthed you, the light that still shines in the darkness of your soul? Pause, breathe, and let this story awaken the divine hope within you. Genesis is not the end. It is the beginning of God's eternal plan, a plan that lives on in you today. If this journey has stirred your spirit, share it, reflect on it, and join us for the next chapter. Discover the story of Exodus, a saga of slavery, plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea, or the courage of Esther, a queen who risked all to save her people. Choose your path and let the mysteries of God's word guide you. May his peace be with you always.